watch this entire 1-hour expose, but here is just a taste of this incredible brave nurse and her revelation as she risks.
To start. All right, first, just to sort of set the setting, I'm interviewing Simon Thornley. He is an epidemiologist from the Auckland University, and I'll let him just maybe introduce himself, because I think maybe a lot of you don't know. And of course, one of the points I'm going to make consistently throughout this is that people like Simon don't get much airtime compared to those that support what I would call the mainstream media government line of the lockdowns and everything else. He's quite there's not many of him and not many of us compared to the majority, and that's one of the questions I'm going to put to him. But Simon, go ahead, introduce yourself in a brief way to the audience and tell them about yourself.
Well, thanks, Jack. I'm Simon Thornley. I'm an epidemiologist. I'm trained in public health. I'm a public health physician. Up until recently, I was working in public health part-time and also teaching in the university and doing a bit of research. So some of the areas I've been looking at is surveillance, also scabies and rheumatic fever. I think that's an exciting new area that could get on top of rheumatic fever. I've also looked at dietary issues in the past, and particularly sugar and low carbohydrate approaches to diet. So that's a reasonably controversial topic.
Well, I know Lustig was one of my favorites early on. You know, I guess you know his work, obviously.
Yeah. Well, he was. We actually invited him across to a conference that we had at the med school, and he really ignited the sugar movement here.
Okay.
You know, he's a very good communicator, very theatrical, very good with the science as well. So and a force of powerful personality to go with it.
Very good. Yeah, so I think the audience gets the sense that you would be considered a expert, although I don't particularly like to use that word, but being in epidemiology and public health, you're someone that has studied in this area. I think you have a PhD, you teach in this area, so you have some authority that I think people obviously look for and should. So great. Now I've just got some sort of questions I'm going to put to you, and then I want to also share some videos with you. Now, one of the articles I looked up that you had published in the Stuff, apparently March the 31st, said, "Do the consequences of this lockdown really match the threat?" And you use the rather vivid metaphor, "We don't want to squash a flea with a sledgehammer and bring the house down." Just tell us a little bit what you mean by that. What was the import of the article?
Well, when I looked at the threat of COVID-19 and I looked at the type of people who were being badly affected by the virus, I could see that it was mainly elderly people who were at high risk of dying of other things. And actually, more latterly, I've seen that the median age of people dying of COVID-19 is about the same as the life expectancy of the general population. And so to me, looking at the threat posed by the virus in terms of mortality, also looking at infection mortality rates, trying to get a good handle on those, knowing that they're often overestimated early in an epidemic when only people in hospital are counted in the denominator. It was clear to me that this virus wasn't as serious as it was being sold as, and that the numbers of deaths that were being portrayed in the media weren't being portrayed with any context at all. And so that, and then when I thought about the other side of this, that financial devastation from locking down a community, something that's really never happened in my lifetime.
Yep.
You know, it's obvious that that's a large factor, and it brings with it health consequences. Particularly, I mean, my thoughts were with small business people who often don't have a lot of money to come and go on. They've got their whole life invested in a business, and you know, and so the health consequences of being without work can be dramatic, and I've experienced that for myself. In my childhood, my father didn't work for a lot of the time, and it really was a major issue for his mental health, his sense of well-being, his sense of purpose in life.
Yes, indeed.
And, you know, I just didn't want New Zealand to go down that path. And so knowing what I knew about what the data was telling me, I was worried for the country.
Yeah, and I think that was well-placed worry, because we're seeing starting the so-called collateral damage is happening with great rapidity now. I was hearing 37,000 out of the 27,000 small businesses, 17,000 have closed. I saw that figure. I don't know how accurate where that came from, but and I noticed that there was just an article out that well-known Max women's clothing that apparently Jacinda likes clothing store. They've closed down 17 of their shops in Auckland. You know, so obviously, but you know, my particular question, you know, of course, you know that originally there was this 80,000 were going to die in New Zealand figure. I think you know that one, right? It was from that report. What was the name? It was a Maori name.
Te Pūnaha Matatini,
Yeah,
I think.
something like that, right. And there was this high-end report. And that's what I think, to my understanding, sort of generated the government's response, because they took this big high figure and said, well, then we can justify locking, closing everything down. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, well, I think that was an important influence in the government's decision, and that I think there was a lot of pressure actually from the medical community to lock down. That's where there was a petition that went to the government.
I had heard about that.
From the community, and I think a lot of it was driven by these astronomical numbers of deaths that were predicted in that document. And it's, looking back at it, it's obviously a massive over prediction.
Slightly different. 80,022, I think, was the last count, or 23 dead. And also, as you mentioned earlier in your talk about, I mean, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, most of these 22, 23 that died are quite old, were quite old. What was the average age?
Well, I tried to work it out, and some of the ages weren't given exactly. So I had to sort of put in a middle figure if just a decade was given. But the average that I got was about 82, which happens to be exactly the same as our life expectancy.
Life expectancy.
So half of us are dead by the time we get to 82, if we get to 82.
Yeah.
So that, from a sort of just basic probability point of view, if the distribution of age of death is no different with COVID than without, then it's clear that COVID is not shortening our lives. And so we are you know, there's some debate about that in the medical community. I've seen some papers which I haven't been able to follow. They're trying to state that we've lost several years with people with COVID, but just that basic analysis to me suggests that we're not losing a lot of years of life lost from this virus and through the direct infections. So then my attention becomes, well, how could we lose life from the unintended consequences of the lockdown? And, you know, we've already seen a suicide in a man from Pukekohe, which, although it's not clear it was entirely due to lockdown, at least some of it was due to the fact that he couldn't keep his business going during the lockdown.
Is this the butcher?
Yes.
Yeah, right. He was one of the first. And because I've been following this, tracking that, and posting on Facebook about it. And as I don't know if you noticed, like I did, you can't, in the New Zealand news that appears on the internet anyway, and I would assume on the street, you don't see the word suicide. If you're not, this sudden death, you can't use the word suicide. I had to go to the outside of New Zealand, and then there was the beauty queen. Did you hear about her too? Yeah, this is another one. I've got 3 or 4 that I found out. It's very hard to find anything because it's all SEO'd, engineered, so you have to search for pages and pages and pages to find anything. That's the first clue that everyone should understand. They make it difficult to find anything that doesn't fit the narrative. So you got to dig. But yeah, she was 23, apparently, you know, came in 3rd in the world thing. And again, they said sudden death, suicide. Yeah. And I tried to get data. Now, this is what I wanted to ask you about too. I tried to get data from the coroner's office here in New Zealand, and they couldn't give me any. They said the most recent we got 2018, 2019. I said, don't you have anything up to date so I can make some comparisons between last year and this time? No, don't have any. So, well, what's your comment on that? Can we get any real data on suicides?
Well, I've actually put an OIA request into the government on that, and I've asked for police attendances to suspected suicides, because I think the problem that you're running into is that there's a delay in terms of attribution of cause of death,
Sure.
and it goes through a coronial process, and that takes forever.
Yeah.
But I think we can be pretty confident that if a policeman turns up to a suspected suicide, it's very, very likely that that is ultimately going to be a suicide. So I'd like to have a look at the trends in that data, even though it's not totally watertight. It's going to give us an indication of what's going on, and it's likely to be a bit more timely.
Okay, so you can go to something in the police area and get some data from there?
Well, the OIA has been referred to the Ministry of Justice. So,
okay, maybe my audience, because I don't, ROA?
Official Information Act.
Oh.
So that's a bit of legislation that allows the public to be able to request to see officially held documents.
Right.
Because the government, you know, there's this idea that government decision-making should be accessible, although it's often not.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, we call that the Freedom of Information Act in the U.S. Okay, now I know what you're talking about. Got you. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So I've actually put a request in around that because I did get a number of emails from people around the country who talked of increased frequency of suicide during the lockdown, and there's been stories from the government that those claims are not substantiated, but I haven't seen any data. So I'd like to see the data and see whether that in fact is true.
And again, just for the audience, this thing about narrative, there's the mainstream government narrative, and then there's what I would call the alternative media narrative, like myself, and I think you would fit into that category to whatever degree that you would say. But and it was just plain with me with that suicide thing with the butcher. They didn't sudden death, and then you never saw it. There was only one ex-politician, Smith or something, put up. He actually used the word suicide. Bob, but anyway, apparently a well-known New Zealand politician. But you can't find this information. But I did find on the net where the government said, do not say that the suicides are going to increase. This is wrong. I actually have an article by the New Zealand government cautioning people should not make this assumption and saying that's wrong. When everywhere else I look, they're going ballistic, but somehow New Zealand is it doesn't happen here in New Zealand. Suicides are not allowed, I guess, in New Zealand now. So
yeah, well, I was skeptical of those comments because it's actually quite difficult if you do a careful time trend analysis to be. I mean, if the numbers are way down, then that's fine, that's easy. But actually, for most time trend analysis, distinguishing a difference from usual is actually quite difficult. And so you've got to do some careful analysis, and you need to present some evidence. And so I've seen various bits of news articles that dismiss the idea that increasing attempted suicide, or at least calls for, not confirmed suicides, but calls to suicides, suspected suicides. So the lack of presentation of any evidence makes me a little suspicious, and certainly hearing the stories from people around the country saying that they're worried that there has been an increase. And so I got one email from a man in Christchurch and another from Southland, and these people had actually done some work with people affected by suicide. So they seem like serious concerns.
Well, we know, would you say as an epidemiologist, my understanding that when I read in this area that poverty is really strongly correlated with suicide and depression and all the rest of it. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I've seen some evidence that in response to mass unemployment effects, suicide rates usually go up by a factor. Well, there's some evidence they go up by a factor of 2 to 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think most of us know this, intuitively. I think it pans out. I just wanted that one feature about the medical community. I'm, I'll declare my interests here. That I'm very wary of I call them the medical mafia, and the psychiatric with the and the pharmaceutical industry, and I work with schizophrenics and et cetera, but this thing about the collateral damage happening, and people kept out of the hospitals who need the operations. And I have a friend that almost died. He had a hernia like I have, and his protruded, and he had difficulty getting in. So have you heard about this as well? I mean,
well, I saw a couple of stories in the media from specialists, and I actually was emailed by several specialists who told me they were concerned that they weren't operating anymore, and that the DHB, one chap was saying the DHB's virtually shut down where he is. So yeah, I think that that's likely that that it'll take some time to be able to look at the evidence here and need a careful look. But yeah, there's a lot of good things that the hospital does
Mm,
that were being the change in focus to COVID, which really trumped absolutely everything,
yeah.
and that was certainly concerning for me.
Can you get any data? Because I was trying to find out about hospitals, and I did find things like clinics in New Zealand are almost going broke. A lot of the medical clinics are going broke. Could you get any information on that, and also about the hospitals in terms of you as an epidemiologist making a model about how many people would potentially have their life expectancy shortened because they can't get in?
Yeah, I haven't gone to that extent just because I haven't had the time,
Right.
Jack. I've been working through this time, and
Anybody else doing that in your community?
well, we've through Plan B, we've had a look at some of the potential impacts, just projecting them really from studies that have already been done. I mean, certainly I've heard that during the lockdown, hospitals were about 50% capacity. In fact, they were lower in terms of occupancy than ever.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's what I heard.
that I've heard from a number of GP friends of mine that that financial stress has been a particular issue. In fact, I was contacted a couple of days ago by a GP who's now lost her job as a result of
Yeah, I heard. I
COVID-19.
I actually got some work on that. Apparently, 60 doctors were furloughed, lost their jobs. We've got that down, definitely in evidence. Now, I just want to insert here. Now, you mentioned Plan B. That's going to be one of my questions. Now, to the audience, Simon apparently is they at the start of this whole lockdown, his group, if you want to call it that, the alternative approach to this came up with a Plan B that was publicized, I understand, and I'll put a link up in our notes about this. But can you just tell us a little bit about Plan B and what group of you sort of came together that had an alternative view to the mainstream?
Well, that germinated after that initial article that you about the sledgehammer and the flea.
Right.
And so a number of academics contacted me from different disciplines. So there was an economist, there was a law professor, ecologist, and a PR guy. And so we formed this group, and the idea was really just to start articulating an alternative view around the need for a lockdown, a balanced approach to the threat of COVID. And so, obviously, just getting organized and showing that this was not just one person. This was a number of academics felt this was an important issue enough to put their name to a proposal to end the lockdown early.
Right.
And to go straight from the lockdown to level 2 right away.
Do you recall what date it was that you submitted that? It's been April, well, before the lockdown of March 26th?
Yeah, it was during the lockdown. Yeah, so I wrote it during a weekend soon after the article, and there was various changes made by other people in the group, and then we posted it. I think on a Monday. It was reasonably early into lockdown.
Okay. Now, I have the names of the people there. Grant Schofield.
Schofield,
AUT, apparently professor of public health. There's a Gerald Sunborn, senior lecturer of population, Pacific Health, Auckland University. Grant Morris, associate professor of law, Victoria University. Anish Chowdhury, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, professor
Anish Chowdhury,
Okay, Chowdhury of experimental economics, Auckland University. Michael Jackson, postdoctoral researcher in biostatistics. Did that cover them all?
Yeah, Grant Morris, a lawyer, associate professor of law, and since then, Jim Gibbs, who's a veterinarian.
Okay, Jim Gibbs.
Lincoln, yeah.
Okay, good. So that's the group, and so you wrote a paper of some sort and then submitted it to the New Zealand government?
We published the plan on our website and then put out a press release.
Okay. And what was the result from the government? Did they respond to you?
Well, we didn't get, we got some veiled responses that, you know, any suggestion that the lockdown was an overreaction were rubbish, and that the
Right.
lockdown was justified. And we certainly saw that the article that was appeared in Stuff was quickly changed and revised in response to what we believe was a phone call from the Beehive.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you had mentioned earlier in a talk with me that your university, which is the University of Auckland, they asked you to take down your website. Is that correct? But you did not do that, thankfully. Good courage, good courage. It takes courage to step up against the machine sometimes. Congratulations. Yeah, I heard about that. So they didn't approve of it, I guess. And did they actually state to you, you must take it down, or how did they word this to you? Was it just an email, or?
It was an email, and it wasn't to me, it was to my colleague. And they said you should consider taking it down.
Okay.
So
Not a direct threat, but
it wasn't direct, but you know, there was you know, coming from a senior person.
Right. I noticed in one of the articles that this Wilson called your plan group to publish modeling and evidence to justify its claims. Do you recall this? What did you do? This guy obviously is what we would call the mainstream backing. What was he referring to, and what did you do in that response?
Well, I haven't done any modeling during this epidemic. I think the reliance on these models, I've actually done this sort of modeling for other diseases in Auckland, such as measles, and I know how inaccurate they are, and the large assumptions that go with them.
Yeah.
And so I haven't actually found it useful to do modeling for this disease. I've actually just looked at a lot of collected data, and I think that you can more confidently draw conclusions from collected data than from models, projected models. Models really tell you about, they project your ideas into the future, and they assume that you're right and that you've made all the correct assumptions. And we can see quite dramatically from this that those assumptions haven't held. I mean, 80,000 deaths hasn't eventuated, and there's been a similar overprediction in the UK and I think the US as well.
Well, that famous, I'm really glad you mentioned about the models, because I'm very much against them from the climate alarmism beginning, and we've seen how consistently wrong. But that Nigel, something from England, London,
Neil Ferguson, I think.
Neil Ferguson, that's right, Neil Ferguson. I mean, how consistently wrong he's been. Now, that's another one I would ask you. I mean, how can anyone believe this guy when he's been so consistently wrong with the horse, the foot in the mouth I call the foot and mouth disease is what he suffers from. And yet they've crashed the world economy on this guy's saying. What do you epidemiologists think about that? It would just make me livid. Yeah, but sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big picture here is in science. If you understand a scenario well, then you can predict the future accurately. But if you don't, then you won't. So if there's one thing that the modeling is telling me, is that we don't understand what, a lot of the things that we think we know about the virus, we don't know.
Yeah.
The key issue with the model that I think I've seen, which I think is probably one of the greatest assumptions that it doesn't hold water, is that we are all, as a population, susceptible to the virus. And it's clear that many of us either have the virus and are asymptomatic, or we're not actually susceptible to the virus anyway, because we have cross-reactivity from other coronaviruses, which kind of makes plausible biological sense. I mean, I think if you take this back to a really sort of simple thing, if you go take your car to a mechanic and they say, I think your gearbox is wrong, I think that's the problem, and then they replace the gear, so you expect, if they're right, that if they replace the gearbox, that the car's going to run well. They're making a prediction about how your car functions, and their understanding of this dynamic complex, which is the car. And in the same way, if people make scientific predictions which don't come true or come to fruition, then it clearly shows that their understanding of the virus is flawed.
Yeah.
And I saw other things in these, it was quite clear if you looked at the case series from China that people who were dying of the virus were elderly and frail and had many other medical issues, and later discovered that there was no difference in terms of life expectancy between cases and non-cases. But there was no mention of that in various models. And in fact, one of the models that I saw worryingly talked about deaths in New Zealand being like of the order of magnitude for World War One.
Right.
It was about 20,000 deaths. Well, these deaths are occurring occurred in World War One and young men in their 20s. This is completely different. In epidemiology, we're trained to sort of think about death. I mean, because death actually happens to all of us, whether we like it or not. And so epidemiologists have adapted various measures, such as years of life lost, to account for the fact that a death in a young person is much more important than a death in an older person, because it's just logical, right? And so there was no accounting for that. It was really just these headline figures of.
And that's what that's what I'd like you to comment on. I mean, it just epidemiologists like you, even though there's only a few of you in New Zealand and maybe in the world compared to the mainstream, I would have thought that you could have at least had some effect on the governments, where they would have to say, well, yeah, we have to think about the collateral damage when the hospitals, people don't come in, people not working, the psychological problems, the domestic violence, the extended upper drug use and alcohol, blah, blah, blah. I mean, but this didn't seem to have any impact at all on the thinking. Why?
Well, I think the focus was, with the idea was that with so many deaths, that the risk was so grave that all the attention went to COVID and to hell with everything else. And that I would, it was very hard to estimate what the effects of this was going to be because nobody had ever done it before.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true.
and
Never done.
so it was quite an unfamiliar scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And it worried me that, secondary consideration for me was the sort of the foregone treatment. My focus really was around the economic devastation
Yeah.
that was happening. I just
And-
sort of assumed people would be able to get treatment.
And I sent you that article. I just got that last night where the Prime Minister of Norway is now saying she maybe overstepped things. She did it out of fear. Did you have a chance to look at that? I gave it to you.
Yeah, I had
Yeah.
saw that before. Yeah,
It's coming out.
Well, I think that it is interesting to see that, and I think one of the things this highlights for me is the difference between politics and science. And in politics, you very rarely see people say, I got this wrong, or I made a mistake.
Yeah.
Very unusual to see it, but actually, I think very refreshing to see it in Scandinavia, because it suggests that people are learning from this, and particularly the politicians are learning from this, and that they can have some confidence in the future that things will be played out differently.
Yeah.
And in science, we know it's okay to say we got it wrong. We're often changing and updating our ideas as new evidence comes along. It's a core part of science. When it's very different from politics. So yeah, I think that issue has sort of crystallized a few things for me, that this is a danger when we've got this interplay between science and politics, with wide sweeping decisions being made and new information coming in, and whether we can adapt our responses for this new information, because the new information has really shown that this virus is no more dangerous than a severe flu. And
I also sent you that article in Norway. The public health minister, I guess the equivalent to that guy here is called Gordon. What's his name? The health minister for New Zealand.
David Clark.
Clark, right. She was also admitted that, maybe we didn't have to do what we did locking down. And she even went so far, I don't know if you noticed the article I sent, and she said, now if the second wave comes again, we will think about not doing this. So, wow, I mean, this is pretty huge admission to me. I was quite actually shocked to find any politician would say this.
Well, I think it's very healthy. As I said, that's really taking a sort of science-based approach, and to be able to say we've got new information, we're changing our ideas, we're changing our policy, we're learning from past mistakes. I think, to me, that's very much a sign of a healthy society. For people to be able to do that, and it's a sort of science-based response, and the political response is often tragically very different.
Yeah, and I guess I'll ask you the $64,000 question. Do you think New Zealand's government is going to do something similar and maybe figure this out, or what?
Well, I think they're very heavily invested in
Yeah, that's my
the
feeling.
decision that they've made.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be very, very difficult for them to change their mind about the justification for the lockdown. Already I've seen articles I've seen an article by president of the College of General Practitioners stating that New Zealand was 1 week away from Italy during the lockdown, and the lockdown averted that. And there wasn't a lot of evidence in that article to support his claim.
Yes.
And from what I've heard from frontline workers, that we were never, ever, if you look at the number of hospitalizations, number of people in ICU, we were never close to what happened in northern Italy. So we're getting these sort of retrospective justifications, which I think are counterproductive. I think we'd be much better off to take the approach that the Scandinavians are taking, which is, we need to learn from this. Was it really justified? If we don't have evidence, then we need to learn from that and not do it again.
Now, a question here is that, with the closure of the borders, and it looks like Jacinda's going to keep this up for at least maybe until even the new year. Is this your understanding? I don't think anything specific has been said, but she's been quoted before as saying that this may last for over a year. I mean, how long can it go on to keep the borders of New Zealand closed? What's your comment as an epidemiologist about this? Can we keep out the virus when it's already here, as you said, anyway? So what kind of justification scientifically can you give for this, to keep borders closed?
Yeah, well, it relates to some of those comments I was saying. We really need to look at the new information coming in. The virus is not as dramatic, not as life-threatening as we initially believed it was. The information from many areas coming that the virus is much more widespread than we believed. And that a large proportion of us have immunity to the virus, even if we don't have antibodies. There's cell-mediated immunity and evidence, biological evidence of cell-mediated immunity in a large proportion of people who've got no antibodies, and many of us.
That's with the T cell thing I think we were talking about, right? Yeah.
And so, putting all that together, also looking at what's happened in other countries that have opened their borders. For example, Slovenia's had their borders open to northern Italy for a couple of weeks, and they haven't had a resurgence. That suggests that they've got widespread immunity. So, yeah, look, my belief is that we should cautiously open the borders, and I think some information that would help us on that path would be some serology information, but I think, from an economic perspective, keeping our borders closed is going to be catastrophic for the country and for jobs, the tourism industry, for travel industry.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and just I think we need to really rethink our approach to the virus. I think this is going to be a virus that we need to learn to live with, just like other coronaviruses that we haven't managed to eliminate, and that we often see a spike in cases during winter, and they often can cause outbreaks in rest homes, as we've seen. And that's where the major threat of the virus is. And so why are we kind of isolating ourselves as a nation over this threat that is very, very targeted towards the older, very frail community? I just don't see that as logical.
Yeah, that's been my take on it, certainly. And now, do you think from your understanding here in New Zealand, did they safeguard the nursing homes well? And is what's kept that? Because almost all of the illness, the deaths I understood occurred in one nursing home in particular, a great deal. Is this right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of nursing homes that were really hard hit by the virus. Yeah, I can't really say how much was effort was gone into protecting nursing homes, but all I can say is that when we released our plan, which specifically mentioned nursing homes, I don't think there'd been a lot of thought about protecting nursing homes. So, and we really saw the government kick into gear about protecting nursing homes after we mentioned the plan.
So maybe you had a little bit of an effect, you hope.
That may be a bit optimistic, but that's what we saw. I think they were so focused on the threat to the whole of society that really the most at risk had been.
Yeah, and I don't know whether I'll just make our audience aware of it. I know in New York City, the predominant deaths, like everywhere, have been the age, but I think it was Como the Blasio or something is the mayor, but Como is the governor of New York. He allowed people that they knew had the COVID to go into the nursing homes, actually sort of made them go in. And this is one of the reasons why they had such a high death rate. Have you heard that same thing as well?
Yeah, I've heard that sounds disastrous. And, I think one of the things we have to think about in the wash up from all this is, did some of the things that we thought we were actually doing to mitigate the threat of the virus, did they actually make things worse?
Of course.
And I think that's a good example. I think I've heard in Italy that all positive cases were taken to hospital in the early phase.
Exactly.
And that had a possible effect of concentrating infection and spreading infection.
Of course, my take on this, because I would be considered with those conspiratorial, tin hat wearers, and I'm convinced of the evidence for this, and I won't ask your comment on that. I don't want to get you in any hot water, but I want to share at the end now with our meeting here. I don't think you've seen this. I'm going to show you an actual on the spot hidden sort of camera exposés, which cannot be refuted. This stuff, I don't know if you've seen it yet. There's a New York nurse online. I've got it. I've downloaded her so I can upload it into BitChute in case YouTube clears it out, which I'm sure they will soon. But it is really, it just blows it up totally. I mean, she has them on camera. The doctor's talking about it, and has got the whole thing. So from my perspective, I call it, the medical mafia, and I think that exists here in New Zealand so far as I can see. And just before we finally go into this last stage, and I show the video, share them with you, in your own estimation, the doctors that you sort of talk with, what kind of percentage would it be that actually are not going along with the government, mainstream narrative? Are we 10%, 5%, less?
I haven't done a formal survey.
I know, but a rough.
I think there's a bit of skepticism around, and certainly talking to the GP, I think that a lot of her colleagues have become skeptical, particularly as it dragged on and as it became clear it wasn't the big thing it was made out to be. And I think the disillusionment of not being able to get timely care for patients that needed it, and the financial hardship of basically not being able to keep afloat. I think there's a number of GPs who are disillusioned now, but only a handful have contacted me to really put their head above the parapet and say, be vocal about it.
I was curious about that, because you're going to see in the interview with this one nurse that she talks. They ask her. This is Del Bigtree. I don't know whether you heard of him. He's just sort of a alternative media popular guy in the U.S. He asked her, "What do you think about nurses like you? How many?" And she surprisingly said she felt the majority felt the way she did, but they didn't have the courage to carry through with that. They just went along with what everyone else was doing, which is, this comes back to that Milgram experiment I think I shared with you. This is consistent with the findings, I think. People obey even though they know it's not right. They continue to do their jobs, unfortunately.
Well, an interesting thing happened during the early time after I released the article, was that I got an email from the Ministry of Health from a senior person there saying, "Thanks for expressing that view. I'd like to, but I can't."
Yeah, understandable. I you need your job to feed your families. I understand. It's just sad for me. That's the way. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. This is pretty dramatic, everybody, that you're going to be seeing things that might be upsetting. So if you, if upsetting things about death, then maybe you should not be looking at this section now. So let me share my screen with you here. Okay, this is, again, this is Del Bigstreet from the US, and he gave a little bit of a vignette of this woman. Here's the woman here, Ardern, I don't know how to pronounce her name, and there's Del Bigtree, but she's the one that, I have her, she's over an hour of footage done by the Journeyman in a very good interview, really good questions asked of her, and she had a hidden camera on her glasses or on her lapel apparently, and she's got the evidence, and you can't refute this. So here, I'll let it just speak for itself. Simon, here you go.
Exists, like you said, but they are not utilizing that.
So if you come in and we don't even know, where are they putting you while we wait to find out?
On the floors, they're putting you inside the hospital facility, and they are mixing COVID and non-COVID, which is creating hospital-acquired infections, nosocomial infections. So they are literally creating the pandemic.
Now, I want to just put everyone in the square here. She was a nurse in Elmhurst. Simon, you know Elmhurst. It's the epicenter of the epicenter, right, in New York City. And it's a poor neighborhood. And this is what everyone should know when you watch the whole videos I've done with her. These are predominantly Black and Hispanic ghetto, people coming in very scared, and it really is a horrible, very, very hard to watch, very hard to watch. And I work in palliative care, so this was a challenge for me to have to stick with it. And if you watch the whole thing, you'll see this. But that's what she's talking about, is the Elmhurst Hospital, where and what's great about this, Simon, is that in the audience, that what's so good about her, not only is she an eyewitness and has them on camera and talk, so it can't be refuted. But she came from Florida, and she has a very long background, 18, 20 years in emergency nursing, worked in Iraq in the war. And so she's got a real background for emergency nursing. And she was in Florida when the virus hit there, and the modality of treatments there was totally different from where she went, and they had no deaths. And they used that oxy, whatever they call it. What's the name of that pill, Simon, the one that they've been using for a long time for malaria?
Hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and they were allowed to use it. They were not allowed to use it in New York, and they had to put them on ventilators. And another thing, which you won't have time to hear, but in the U.S., because it's Medicare, Medicaid that pays for the hospital, apparently if $8,000 regularly if you're influenza serious treatment, you're paid for $18,000 if you can put them down as COVID-19, and if you put them on a ventilator, you get $38,000. So there's obviously some incentives here, unfortunately, and here she is.
That way.
Unbelievable. Just because this is something we've been reporting on, I remember there was another nurse a few weeks back that spoke out about, I believe, the same hospital. Let's just take a look at what she had to say here.
Literally, like, Black lives don't matter here. And I mean, that's pretty sad that somebody who is white and lives hundreds of miles away from the city gives more about these people than the actual people in this city. These people aren't dying from COVID. Let me give you several examples here. An anesthesiologist intubated the patients, and for about 5 hours, like, we were waiting on a chest x-ray to confirm that the placement was wrong. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, and we've told the anesthesiologist that it was placed wrong, because, like, literally only one side of the chest is, like, inflating. He dies. Okay. A patient had a heart rate of 40. I was literally ran out of, like, the patient's room to get, like, the director of nursing was standing out there. And I'm like, can you stop him? He's going to kill that patient. He's going to kill that patient if he defibrillates him with bradycardia and a heart rate of 40. And the director of nursing just shook his head. And I turned around and he killed the dude. It's like going in Twilight Zone. Like, everyone here is okay with this. Look, the only way I can kind of put this into context for everybody is, and this is going to be kind of an extreme example, this is like really the only thing I can come up with, is like if we were in Nazi Germany and they were like taking the Jews to go put them in a gas chamber, I'm the one like there saying, hey, this is not good, this is bad, this is wrong, we should not be doing this. And then everyone tells me, hang in there, you're doing a great job, you can't save everybody. They're murdering these people.
That was Nurse Nicole Surtek. I did make a mistake. I guess she wasn't at Elmhurst while she was recording that video, but obviously you're not alone. Inside of the hospital system where you work, are you alone? Are you a minority? Are you a majority? What's happening with the nurses? And many of you are journeyman nurses, right? Many of you are traveling into New York to help out. What would you say, how many people are looking at this the same way that you and Nicole are?
That's a good thing to bring up, because this is the problem I'm seeing with it. I actually spoke with Nicole on the phone last night, and we were talking about this, is that the majority of the nurses there feel the same way I do. And we talked about it. I actually have it recorded. I was there for a month and recorded the entire time. So what people have seen is just a sliver. And all these nurses feel the same exact way, but everybody is afraid to speak out for the reason that they're threatened with obviously being sent home. If you ask, questions, if you try to, stick up for your patients and advocate for your patients like nurses are supposed to do, you are reprimanded. And, they say over and over, don't make any problems, keep it easy, we don't want to get kicked out, and a lot of it is just based around either being scared of what's going to happen to you, or, they don't want to lose that paycheck.
Wow. And it's actually, my understanding is You were in Florida. You were a nurse there. You were involved in treating COVID-19 patients there, correct?
Correct, yes.
Now, was there a difference that, like, we just heard a report about hydroxychloroquine. There's a huge Lancet paper has just withdrawn this study that said that hydroxychloroquine.
Did you know this one, Simon, about this study in the Lancet?
I haven't looked at it closely.
Okay, yeah. This is really great. It's like with climate alarmism. They've retracted the paper because it was so sus with everything, they just withdrew it. So again, like climate alarmism, they crank out the scientists who are basically on the payroll as far as I'm concerned, and they crank out this quick one to put it all down and devilize this generic, non-patentable, very cheap drug. And that's what happened. And now they've quelled that whole thing, and that's what he's talking about.
Was dangerous. Were they using hydroxychloroquine in Florida where you were?
Absolutely. So we use the hydroxychloroquine and we use the zinc. And when I arrived in New York, I found out very quickly that that was totally off limits. And if you did, or any provider did prescribe it, it would be grounds to be fired.
Where was that coming from? How high up did that go?
So it was from Governor Cuomo, and that was as early as March, right around March. And that's just how that's how it went.
And by the way, too, Cuomo is the guy that ordered the nursing homes in New York City to be filled with the people that had the COVID and caused so many deaths. He did this. We have absolute evidence. There's no question about this. No question about it.
You had to listen to it. And what I found is so ironic, in that same, those same orders, they granted all these medical professionals, they were all liability free if anything happened. So when you're inside these hospitals, already a very, hospital that has very bad reviews, it's public, you have liability-free medical professionals treating patients on ventilators with no family. So what do you think is going to happen?
That leads me to, in this incredible expose, what you described as maybe the worst day of your life. Remember, this is an Iraqi war vet.
Prepare yourself.
Who has seen a lot of bad days, I would guess. Take a look at what she describes as the worst day of her life.
A 37-year-old, which is my age, was not a DNR, is a full code. His family in depth discussed with the doctors that they want us to do everything they can.
DNR, do not resuscitate, everybody, right?
And to save him. Like, he came in talking, he was very terrified. He was just like, totally alert, knew what was going on, and they convinced him to be on a vent. Now he's dead. But the doctor said when I got into shift that if he codes that we are not to resuscitate or try to save him. And we flipped.
This is important. I just asked him if he could put it on our order, and he said no. That's up to the attending.
Okay. So we're going to code them.
That's what I said, and they said no, we're not. I said yes, we are. We're obligated to. So then
You got to say something like it's our license. Unfortunately, you guys got to put it in order. Just something.
That's what I said. I said I'm obligated.
Yeah.
What did she say? Then she's like, the higher up said. I said, I don't care what they said. We're higher up God. We don't have a God here making decisions. I don't care what they said. So we're supposed to. He's not DNR, but we're treating it as DNR. Did his family know?
His family knows the situation. I think they called them and they told them. They were trying to do a two-way all day he spent like in the 80s after. It was this one on the forehead thing. When I changed it, I was like, oh, shoot, it's 90.
Yeah.
So they started playing around with the
Shoot, it's
So
90.
he told him,
He changed the pulse ox
put him on EC.
from his head to his finger, and he's like, oh, it's 90.
Well, Elmhurst does have a policy given, like a COVID policy, given the scarcity of
Right.
dialysis and
It
blood.
can be a chem code, it can be whatever.
But it's not, there's not it's a difference. Normally the standard is whatever the family
Right.
says, like you just do. So
Right.
they would say coding for about 5 years, like you just do that.
Right.
until they die. It's a little bit different now because of the new policy in place, with our place, which is that you don't need full family consent. Like,
You don't need the family consent.
We're not willing to just pour blood and resources into something that would be impossible with that. But look, it's true. He's 37.
All I can think about is that at least he knows that we were fighting for him when he died. No.
Aaron, we hear that the victims of COVID-19 tend to be over the age of 65 and suffering from other life-threatening illnesses. What you are describing and talking about, this is a 37-year-old man, correct?
Yes.
And as a nurse, it seemed, look, I understand there are scenarios where, you can't resuscitate, or it really wouldn't make sense. Someone is so far gone. But can you tell me what it was like to be hearing that and going through this over a young man with his whole life ahead of him, a family that is unable to visit and see how he's doing? You're the only person representing that family in that moment, are you not?
I mean, he's all that we had, he doesn't have a voice otherwise, and like these families are trusting in us to be taking care of them and trust us to do our jobs right. And if they don't have a good nurse, they really don't have a chance at all. And even if they have a good nurse, who's to say the next nurse on the shift or the next doctor on the shift is going to be good too? And it just goes against every single thing that we've ever learned and that we're taught to do as nurses, just to be ethical. And when something's wrong, we have to speak out about this, because if we don't do it, then who's going to? And whatever it takes and whatever I have to risk, at least I know that I'm giving these patients and their families the justice that they deserve. And so be it.
Jack, I've got to go.
Yeah, I know. I'm just going to end it now. Thank you. Good. Yeah, but I thought that was, a dramatic way to end it. Thank you, Simon, for coming in. Had you seen this? This is the first time for you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's all there. And if you share it with your colleagues, I think it will make a really incredible splash, as it should. I think this needs to be seen by every medical person in the world. They need to really know what action was happening. And you can't refute this. She's got it on camera, as you saw. Thank you for being with us, and we'll post this up, and take care of yourself. See you soon.
Thanks, Jack.
All the best.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.